Good morning and good afternoon, and depending on wherever you are. And I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for participating in our launch event of a project sharing good practices in protecting the victims of modern slavery and workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Tom Obokata, and I am the principal investigator of this project. But before going any further, I'd like to say a few housekeeping issues. First, you can switch between various views, for example, speaker view, gallery, and so on by clicking on the appropriate button at your top. Today, we also have a simultaneous French interpretation. And for this, you could click on globe and choose your language. We also have an international sign language interpretation also. And if you have any question or comments, please use the Q&A box and type your comments there so that we will be able to answer anything later. And this event is being live streamed through YouTube, and the link is provided very, very shortly. And finally, report is now also available in the website of the Minority Rights Group International, which will be also provided. And this report is available in all official UN languages. With that, I'd like to invite Professor Alex Balch from Modern Slavery, Human Rights and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center to say a few words. Alex, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's great to be here. We're really excited to hear more about this brilliant piece of work in this report. My name's Alex Balch. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Liverpool, and I'm also director of research at the Modern Slavery PEC. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes just giving you a background to the PEC and our funding in this area on COVID-19. So what is the PEC? We are a 10 million investment in research and evidence on modern slavery that is it's a consortium of 6 institutions that work on this topic. And we do a series of open calls and more targeted calls for high quality research to impact and make a difference in terms of policy making on modern slavery. So this project we're talking about today is part of a number that we funded on COVID-19, and that was an urgent rapid call that we put out to try and find out what is happening during COVID-19 and what policymakers can do to make a difference. So those 11 projects are all producing outputs which will be available on the Modern Slavery PEC website. But today we really welcome the report by Tom and his team, not least because of the extremely difficult and challenging times to conduct research during the pandemic. But that just makes it more important that we find out what the effects of the pandemic have been on victims and workers. And we particularly welcome the emphasis of the report on human rights and solidarity, but also the alignment with our guiding principles, which are to produce evidence that is more focused on effectiveness of policies, to scrutinize the inequalities which underlie modern slavery, and also the perspectives of survivors. So there's a great alignment there with Tom's report and the PEC's guiding principles. Finally, I just wanted to add that this event coincides with the ILO's International Labour Conference. I just wanted to flag a report that's been released by the Director General, which is work in the time of COVID, which is of course very, very relevant to the discussion we're going to have today. Really looking forward to hearing about the findings, and I'll just hand over now back to Tom. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. Now we'd like to proceed with project. But before that, what I'd like to do is to give you a brief introduction or background to this project. Now, key aims and objectives are to identify major impact of pandemic on modern slavery, to identify and share good practices in mitigating these impacts and critically analyzing their effectiveness and appropriateness. Third, to propose concrete and relevant recommendations to be followed. And finally, to develop guiding principles on actions against modern slavery in emergency situations. The project team consists of myself and a colleague, Forough Ramezankhah from Keele University, and Sam Gogsa and Rasha Saba from Minority Rights Group International. In terms of research focus, we have decided to take a global approach by examining all regions of the world in all sectors. This is in order to reach out to wider audience. As to research methods, we have analyzed an emerging literature in the form of reports published by governments, regional and international organizations, non-governmental stakeholders, as well as academic research. And in order to triangulate these materials, we have conducted virtual interviews with over 30 stakeholders, particularly civil society organizations and trade unions located in all regions of the world. And some of them are here today. So on behalf of the project team, I would like to thank their important contributions to the project. With that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Forough Ramezankhah, who will explore the key impacts of the pandemic on modern slavery.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us here. The section I'm going to concentrate on is on the multi-dimensional impacts of the pandemic on modern slavery. So the project has identified 3 major impacts, as you can see on the screen. So a major impact on anti-slavery actions and protection of victims, major impact on employment, creation of vast and widespread unemployment, and impact on modern slavery. So in terms of the first major impact, there has been a massive disruption to all the efforts in terms of fight against modern slavery. So it starts from reallocation of all the resources in order to fight the pandemic. So obviously there are less resources allocated to different types of measure to fight modern slavery, from identification, investigation, prosecution, punishment of perpetrators, and also protection, support, and compensation provided to the victims of modern slavery. At the same time, civil society has also been affected by the impact of resources reallocation. But as we heard from our in the interviews from the civil society, they have been impacted because of the lack of funding and the fact that face-to-face support given to victims of modern slavery has been stopped at the time that it was most needed. But at the same time, the civil society has tried very hard to use innovative approaches to create funding. So they've done an extremely important job. And also they have, because of the lockdown and remote working, this is applicable to government agencies, authorities, and civil society. There has been this lack of resources, and also this remote working, as I mentioned, but also inspection of labor. So all of these together has created a very adverse impact impact on fight against modern slavery and unemployment. So because of the pandemic has been indiscriminatory in terms of its effect on public health and risk to individuals, but it has been very discriminatory in terms of its effect on low-income countries and very marginalized and vulnerable workers and people. So in terms of employment, we were interested to know about the movement from formal economy to informal economy. Our research has not found a widespread movement from formal economy to informal economy. And obviously this is because of the protection that the government has provided to workers. But again, there is this discrepancy between high income states and low income states. In terms of movement from formal to informal economy, there are emerging trends. For example, in Brazil, we see that indigenous people, ethnic minorities, are more affected, and there is a movement from, because of the unemployment, from formal economy to informal economy. But at the same time, the pandemic has created this double standard. In a sense, at the same time as very many jobs and sectors have been affected. In other words, there has been a lack of needs for particular productions or types of employment. On the other hand, there has been this surge of demand for certain sector and certain kind of labor and jobs. So again, this is rather obvious. Health and social care, and food processing, or medical supply, for example, PPE. So we see in countries very strong in garment industry, they have redirected their production from garment to PPE. So only examples could be Cambodia, Pakistan, India. But what this has created is, again, this double harm. In other words, those laborers, those workers in these industries, they have suffered longer hours and possible exploitation. And we should remember this, that the protection of workers, including migrant workers, should not only lie at the end of the producing states producing, for example, PPE, or the supply of certain products which are in high demand. But at the same time, there is this expectation that the consumer states also take measures to protect the workers. So a kind of supply and demand, but at the same time, the responsibility is not only at the door of the producing states. So all in all, if we were to summarize the major impacts of COVID-19 and pandemic, it has been, we can summarize it in the word exacerbation. So it's just worsening of what it was, and especially for marginalized, from women, children, migrant workers, asylum seekers, refugees, indigenous people. And the one point about migrant workers is that the issue with language, for instance, when they are in a different country, they're not only subject to immigration, harsh immigration laws, but also a lot of information is based on the language that they don't understand. For instance, my own research highlights that sometimes these workers are not even aware of their own rights, never mind to utter them and expect to receive support in terms of what they legally are should be given to. And also children have been unduly affected by exploitation. Just as an example, in countries in Africa, children, because of closure of schools and a number of other factors, for instance, poverty, lack of resources, and absence of security, they have been recruited by armed groups. On the other hand, different types of impact, for instance, in European or Western countries, there has been a massive increase of online child exploitation. So we have reports from Interpol, and even Europol says that the child exploitation, pornography on darknet has increased massively. So different countries, different nations have been affected by this pandemic in different ways. And also, lastly, for instance, the LGBTQ and women and children in informal economy, they have been engage in transactional sex, but because they don't fall under the ambit of protection of the government, they have been affected very, very adversely. So I am going to hand over to my colleague, Sam, who would continue with this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Forough. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the good practices that we've identified by governments and civil society in mitigating these impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on vulnerable workers and victims of modern slavery. Just share my screen. Great. So the way we've grouped these findings of the good measures implemented for mitigation is under 3 key areas. And the first would be anti-slavery actions, which Forough touched upon just now. Though anti-slavery efforts were really hindered during the pandemic, we have identified that efforts to continue investigations, labor inspections, and prosecutions did continue in many states. In Europe, for example, the EU's Agency for Criminal Justice remained fully operational and facilitated many joint investigations. There was one key example of facilitating teams in Romania and Finland, which led to prosecution of Romanian organized criminal groups. We also saw many states ranging from Australia to Nigeria to even the UK switch from physical court hearings to virtual court hearings relatively quickly, which was a positive measure. Many governments also continued the provision of essential services for victims of modern slavery. These services included counseling, medical assistance, subsistence, and financial support. And lastly, one area that needs to be emphasized is that though there were many actions to continue these anti-slavery measures, civil society organizations played and filled a major gap left by governments in protecting these victims of modern slavery. The second key area have been good practices in mitigating unemployment. So a very popular measure has been job retention and wage subsidies. At the time of writing this report, we identified that it was implemented by over 120 states. And many of these states were using existing legislative frameworks or administrative frameworks to assist the affected workers. Others instead introduced new ones, ad hoc and temporary schemes, designed specifically to address the unemployment caused by COVID. Secondly, we saw that public works or projects were offered to unemployed workers. And here it's worth highlighting that many employment opportunities were being offered to foreign nationals as well in various states, specifically in the agriculture, construction, and healthcare sectors. We saw, for example, many looking for manufacturing and PPE. And lastly, one thing we noticed was a continuation or increased effort in coordination with trade unions, between trade unions and businesses to protect employment for workers. And so in this slide, I just visually mapped out a few key measures we noticed that were aimed at improving living and working conditions for victims of modern slavery and vulnerable workers. The first being cash transfers, which were very popular. Again, at the time of publishing this report, we documented that more than 150 states implemented cash transfer as a measure. Many provided them to all of their citizens, and we saw this in the US, in Tuvalu, in Mongolia, just to name a few. But we also saw that others targeted vulnerable populations specifically, and those vulnerable populations include informal workers, health and social care workers, refugees, the self-employed, and returned migrants, for instance. Secondly, we saw that social assistance widely was strengthened. And by this, we refer to strengthening of unemployment benefits, extended leaves, measures such as these. And a good example of this, I would say, was from the Philippines, where we saw a special social security scheme offered unemployment benefits to up to 60,000 workers who lost their jobs during the pandemic. And in the second phase of this scheme, it actually targeted 500,000 informal workers that were left out in the first phase of the scheme. So seeing this effort was, just as an example, was a good measure. Thirdly, we saw safety at work policies. So we saw additional safety measures and legislation introduced to ensure measures such as social distancing in the workplace and use of PPE were enforced in the workplace. And using this legislative measure is important because that way employers can be legally accountable, of course, for non-compliance. And the last two areas that I've identified here were food relief, utility payments, and rent support. So actually seeing that lots of food distributions were organized across the world, as well as assistance with paying utility bills. And that was actually, the latter was offered in, I believe, an estimated 80 states and territories, so very popular. And for the last box, before I wrap up, is information and awareness campaigns on labor rights. We saw, must emphasize that civil society organizations played a key role here in ensuring that labor rights were, vulnerable workers were informed of their rights. I can give an example just from here in London. We saw that the mayor provided financial assistance to organizations working on labor rights to produce films in various languages on what workers' rights were. And we saw similar initiatives in places like India as well. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague, Rasha, to give us a bit of a critique on these measures.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all for joining. So yeah, I will be focusing on the critical analysis of these good practices that Sam was talking about. So our project has uncovered several issues that undermining these practices. So let me just share my screen. So in terms of anti-slavery actions, there have been some challenges documented. The first is the insufficient support to victims. The amount of support given to victims of modern slavery during the pandemic has been regarded as insufficient. And this was the case in many states, including the UK. In regard to the efforts of civil society during the pandemic also, some governments have not recognized these contributions, and in some cases even their activities have been suspended. Our research also has documented some difficulties in provided services of victims of modern slavery due to the spread of COVID-19 among frontline workers and the victims themselves. This led to forcing the suspension of services and shutdown of secure accommodations that these victims used in the pandemic. The next analysis will focus on the economic and social assistance to unemployed workers. As my colleague mentioned, steps have been taken by many governments to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. However, the effectiveness of these measures has been questioned as a result of several issues. One of this issue is sustainability of these measures. The very nature of these measures is temporary, ranging from 1 month to 1 year, and many of these measures also have been discontinued during the pandemic. We see that especially in measures targeting the workers in the informal sector, especially in terms of food support assistance or cash transfer, they are more likely to be one-off assistance. In addition, these measures has been regarded as inadequate, especially in the case of low and middle and low income countries. For example, the support and assistance provided by governments in Afghanistan, in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, India, Mauritania, and Syria have been regarded insufficient and needed to be supplemented with contributions from civil society, faith-based organizations, and trade unions. Another major issue is that various support measures are not implemented for all workers and exclude many vulnerable populations. For example, the job retention scheme that my colleague mentioned before have targeted mostly workers in the formal economy and leaving many in the informal sector uncovered. Our project also has uncovered some challenges at the implementation level. These include lack of effective infrastructure and accountability mechanisms. Corruption and excessive bureaucracy have been also a big barrier. Language difficulty, so the lack of making message available in languages accessible by migrant workers and indigenous people also was documented. Lack of effective communications, as Forough mentioned, not only for in the case of migrant workers, but also for indigenous people. So also various issues have been also identified in relation to living and working conditions. For instance, the accommodations for migrant workers in many parts of the world are still unsanitary and overcrowded, putting them at risk still from COVID-19. The availability of hand sanitizer and PPE has been also limited, especially for the informal workers in the informal sector. We also have been documented limited access to testing and treatment for COVID-19, especially for vulnerable groups, for example, stateless and undocumented workers in many parts of the world. Lastly, the businesses have not been doing enough to protect the welfare of workers. For example, in the Gulf states and even beyond, our project has documented some abusive conditions, such as non-payment for wages, long working hours, and without unpaid leave. I will stop here and will hand over to Tom to talk about the guiding principles. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now I'd like to move on to, first of all, discussing recommendations based on our research findings. And I will try to, Rasha, if you could stop the screen, then I can share my, thank you. Now I'd like to start with the recommendations based on our research findings. In relation to anti-slavery action, states must investigate, prosecute, and punish modern slavery during the pandemic by allocating or maintaining sufficient resources. Financial investigations and criminal asset recovery must be an integral part of law enforcement responses because they can mitigate the resource constraints felt by a large number of states. States must protect all victims without discrimination. Tailored assistance must be provided, particularly to vulnerable groups, including women, children, indigenous peoples, minorities, internally and externally displaced persons, migrant workers, and informal workers. Confiscated criminal proceeds should be used to secure access to protection, justice, and remedies for victims in the first instance, and the rest could be used for other purposes such as enhancing the capacity of law enforcement and other public authorities, or enough assistance being given to civil society and other important stakeholders. In relation to protection of workers, states should provide support to all affected workers without discrimination, bearing in mind the vulnerable groups just mentioned. States must not relax or suspend labor and social protection laws and measures which have been observed in some parts of the world. In addition, states and businesses must enhance working conditions by guaranteeing equal and sufficient wages, reasonable working hours, and annual and sick leave, to name but a few. They must do more to improve the health and safety at work in order to reduce the COVID-19 infection. And we also have wider recommendations to be considered. First, states must protect children from the worst forms of child labor and exploitation. In this regard, all children must be able to continue their education during the pandemic. Second, international cooperation is essential. Developed states and international organizations, including financial institutions, should assist low and medium income states which have been struggling to address both the pandemic and modern slavery. Third, states should formalize informal work as expeditiously as possible. As highlighted previously, the exploitation, abuse, precariousness increase as workers move from the formal economy to the informal one, and there is an urgent need to extend protection to all workers, regardless of the sectors. And finally, states should tackle underlying causes, particularly poverty, inequality, and discrimination, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And these and other recommendations are noted in our report. So hopefully you have a chance to read them after this event. And finally, I'd like to present the guiding principles on actions against modern slavery in emergency situations. We decided to develop these in order to remind states of core obligations that they must fulfill even in emergency situations. And we also hope that they can be used as a tool for advocacy by non-governmental stakeholders to encourage governments to take firm action against modern slavery. These principles that we have identified are based on the relevant provisions of the existing international and regional human rights treaties, as well as the decisions and opinions delivered by human rights mechanisms. We will start with the general principle. Principle 1, human rights must be at the center of actions against modern slavery. Modern slavery is not simply a criminal offense, but also constitutes a gross violation of human rights. And it is important to remind states that international human rights law, including obligations with regard to modern slavery, continue to apply in emergency situations, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, armed conflict, and natural disasters. Principle 2, states must continue to investigate, prosecute, and punish modern slavery. This obligation is or cannot be derogated even in times of public emergency, as established in international and regional human rights treaties. Principle 3, law enforcement responses must be conducted in accordance with the existing human rights norms and principles. This is particularly important when governments decide to employ special investigative techniques such as surveillance and interception of communications, which raises a number of human rights issues, such as the right to privacy. Principle 4, financial investigations and confiscation of criminal proceeds must be an integral part of anti-slavery responses. Some human rights mechanisms in the past noted that illicit financial flows deprive states of resources to protect all human rights: civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. So this obligation can be established under international human rights law. Principle 5, states must continue to identify and protect the victims of modern slavery. This is closely interlinked to the first prohibition obligation, and therefore we regard this as a non-derogable duty on the part of states. Principle 6, states must ensure that businesses and employers respect and protect human rights in accordance with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Principle 7, states must ensure access to justice and remedies through legislative, administrative, judicial, and other means. And this is an obligation firmly established under international human rights law. Principle 8, in facilitating protection, states should cooperate actively with civil society organizations and trade unions who have wealth of experience and expertise in victim protection. Principle 9, states should improve the working and living conditions of workers. Now, this is particularly important as it will prevent them from being subjected to slavery, forced labor, and other slave-like practices. And there are certain minimum obligations which must be fulfilled even in times of public emergencies, including guaranteeing the fair and minimum wages, reasonable working hours, paid leave, and public holidays. Principle 10, states must continue to prevent modern slavery. This wider prevention obligation, once again, is closely interlinked to the first obligation to prohibit slavery and also protect victims. And measures to be implemented here includes awareness raising and training of law enforcement and other public authorities charged with anti-slavery actions. And there are wider issues which also must be considered. And finally, principle 11, international cooperation and solidarity are crucial in continuing anti-slavery actions. High-income states, international and regional organizations, including the financial institutions, must assist low and medium-income countries, which are more likely to struggle in implementing action against modern slavery during emergency situations. And we have seen that in times, in the case of COVID, and that also applies to other situations. And this is an obligation established not just by international human rights law, but also by the United Nations Charter. So legal obligation is there. Thank you, and that concludes our presentation today. And now we'd like to see if there are any questions that you would like to answer. And if you have any question or comment, please do use your Q&A box so that we can monitor that and answer them for you. Thank you. Right, okay, so we have one question about climate change, displacement of people and the adaptation to this displacement. And yes, I mean, so that displacement is a kind of broad context, I believe. But the point is, as if they have been displaced and either internally or externally, and regardless of reasons, either persecution, climate change, or other reasons such as armed conflict, that increases the vulnerability, certainly, of them being subjected to slavery, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. So I think this is one of the issues that we did not cover that in this particular context because we are focused on COVID-19 pandemic, which had more visible impact. But I think it is important to address different types of displacement in the future. And I think this is a very important, perhaps the future topics for research to be considered. We also have another question. Did you see any risks to asylum seekers and refugees? Yes, once again, the displacement creates a particular vulnerability for those people. First of all, because most of them are destitute and they do not have a means to support themselves. And so what happens then is that they are more likely to be exploited by particularly criminals, organized criminal groups, and so on. We have seen some evidence, for example, of women and girls in refugee camps being targeted by organized criminal groups for sexual exploitation. And there are potentially other instances of exploitation. And asylum seekers, as you may know, do not have a solid legal status in given country, and oftentimes they are not entitled to work while their decision is pending, and that makes it even more difficult. So these are some of the areas that we have noticed. And another question, what about modern slavery and direct discrimination? I'm not too sure what actually is meant by that, but I mean, discrimination has been a cause of modern slavery throughout the history. So, I mean, in our project, we have seen, even as noted by, for example, Rasha and other colleagues, even though some of these measures have been, in theory, implemented for all affected workers. And we have seen some good examples as highlighted by some, like particular attention has been paid to, for example, migrant workers, including undocumented workers and also displaced populations. But we have also seen examples of discrimination, for example, in those held in caste-based discrimination in Asia and descent-based slavery in Africa and so on. They have found it quite difficult to access these support and protection measures, and that in a sense seems to be direct or even indirect forms of discrimination, which needs to be tackled. Again, this is also interlinked to the major cause. And one of the things that we found is that, something like discrimination has been exacerbated, as with any other forms of emergency situations like armed conflict and natural disasters. And these that are something that we need to pay attention, the states need to pay attention to tackle. Slavery, not a modern phenomenon. Millennia of caste slavery is still the main cause of child labor, forced labor, and bonded labor, and no wages. Absolutely, as I just said, and these has been particularly exacerbated during the context of the COVID-19 pandemic for the reasons I just said. And I think there is an urgent need to extend protection to those particularly vulnerable groups, including those held in caste-based slavery, descent-based slavery, and other populations facing discrimination, such as documented and undocumented migrant workers, indigenous peoples, and workers with disabilities, and older workers. And I think we need to pay attention equally to all of these populations. Another question, Ricardo from SOAS, a question: have you found cases in which the irregular status of migrants prevented access to essential services? Yes, in a sense. As I said, there are some good examples, but because of the status of irregular status or even illegal status, many of them are actually quite reluctant to seek support during the pandemic because they fear law enforcement actions. And that is deterring them from seeking assistance. And even though they may be entitled to bare minimum services such as medical emergency, I mean, that is being implemented even for undocumented workers, for example, in many parts of the world. But once again, the fear of enforcement and lack of knowledge, the government do not always provide that information to these workers. And therefore, they are not likely to reach out to the public authorities for help. And I think this is a vicious cycle, which is also happening not just within a COVID context, but in other situations as well. Furthermore, have you found any case in which states exploited COVID-19 measures to tackle illegal migration? Within a context of our research, we did not find clear evidence in that regard. So we are not in a position to mention that, but I think that may be something that can be a topic for future research. Thank you. In Kenya, we observed that during the pandemic, we had an increase in child marriage cases. Do you think that the increase of some of streams and maybe decrease in others of human trafficking is a global phenomenon? I think that is a very good point. And we have heard from various sources that external or international human trafficking has decreased to an extent because of the closure of borders. And that may be the case, but I mean, that does not mean that it has stopped completely, because we have also heard, for example, in the continent of Africa, there still continue to be movements within different countries in Africa, or that also happened in Europe. In continental Europe, people, women and children are being trafficked from one country in Europe to another for sexual and labor exploitation. So I think, so the criminals, as in any other emergency situations like armed conflict, criminals, including sophisticated organized criminal groups and terrorist groups, have taken advantage of this emergency situation. And this is something that we also need to pay closer attention to. And if you are interested, my report as a UN Special Rapporteur to the General Assembly this year will be focusing on the role of organized crime and contemporary forms of slavery, where I'll be looking at some of the mode of operations and see how they are taking advantage of these situations. Can we call indirect discrimination like modern slavery? Modern slavery, yes, I mean, depending on the responses, I mean, modern slavery happens because of discrimination. Certain victims are discriminated because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, culture, religion. And so, so that's a direct discrimination. And in terms of the policy responses, if the states are not providing protection to all people without discrimination, that may be regarded as either direct or even indirect or even direct discrimination. In what obligations, certainly non-discrimination is one of the most fundamental principles in international human rights law, and that needs to be tackled by all states. Did you find any increased engagement of unions and effectiveness in their support and protection for migrant workers? And absolutely yes, trade unions have been at the forefront of the protecting the rights of workers during the pandemic. And we had a pleasure of being able to speak to a number of trade union colleagues in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they are providing support to that, not just domestic, constituents, but also migrant workers, and including foreign and migrant workers, and internally and externally displaced persons. And I think that's examples of good practice that needs to be emphasized. Now we all know that the civil society organizations have been playing an important role in this, but we often tend to ignore the roles played by other human rights defenders, such as trade unions. And one of the benefits of this project that we all learned is their role, and their role should be actively promoted, and that we intend to do. Some internationally agreed principles to guide states in relation to their continuing obligation to counter modern slavery during emergency. Sorry, that has been gotten rid of. Sorry, I just didn't see that. Sorry, Susan from Netherlands. In Netherlands, there are now media news reports about Eastern European migrant workers that lost their jobs, and so also the access to accommodation that was organized by recruitment agencies or companies that employ them. Many started to sleep on streets or try to access shelters and so on. Did you also see this in other countries? And we did not did a systematic studies of the role of employment agencies and so on. But yes, the employers not providing sufficient support to migrant workers in different parts of the world, including Europe and so on. And that we have seen. So not providing secure accommodation and other benefits and support, and that has been exacerbated during the pandemic. Now, as many countries are obviously coming from the pandemic, and things are started gradually being improving, but my guess is that because still a number of states are struggling to contain the virus and also the modern slavery, I think some of our findings will be quite relevant in the future.
Tom, the
yes.
question that went missing, it's in the chat box now. The one that started with some internationally agreed principles to guide states in relation to their continuing obligations to counter modern slavery during emergency would be very useful. In your capacity as UN Special Rapporteur, do you think there is appetite at governmental and intergovernmental level for adopting such a set of principles? And if so, what would you see as the process from here and the timetable to eventual adoption?
Thank you very much. I have considered this, and it would be wonderful to be able to use this set of guiding principles. These are the kind of initial starting point, and I'm sure that there are other principles that must be incorporated. So what we are hoping to do as a project team is to explore the possibility of developing them further by involving all relevant stakeholders, including victims and survivors, civil society organizations, trade unions, international and regional organizations. And it is to be able to kind of have a concrete action plan or guiding principles which can be applied. And I am exploring various possibilities. At this stage, it's very difficult to say the timeline and so on, but I will be able to follow up on this in the near future. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we are now coming to an end of this seminar. And once again, I'd like to thank all the participants for coming to this event today, wherever you are, and your participation is very much appreciated. I also like to thank once again those who have contributed to this project by becoming an interviewees. Many of them are here today also. As I just said, from the way forward, I do believe that that situation is still ongoing, and therefore our findings will be very still relevant. So what we would like to do then is to disseminate our findings as widely as possible using our networks of individuals and organizations in different parts of the world, and disseminate information of our findings, as well as promoting our guiding principles to see if there are any, in a way that has just been highlighted, and if there's any appetite in developing these principles, which we think are quite useful, and we would certainly like to see them develop further. And we'll certainly be in touch about that. And in the meantime, I would very much appreciate your comments, feedback, critique in relation to our findings, as well as the guiding principles, so that we can develop them further. So with that, could I, once again, the report now is available in all official languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, of course, French, and Spanish, and Russian. So feel free to use them. And also, I would like to seek your assistance in disseminating our findings and principles. So with that, thank you very much once again for your time today. And please do feel free to get in touch with us if you have any further comments and so on. So thank you very much.